Welcome to our third day of our Energy Efficiency Symposium. This is our third annual Energy Efficiency Symposium provided by Energy Brain and Mitsidi. And today we will be talking about the challenges of the energy transition in Brazil and in Canada. So those of you who are watching have probably noticed that we are doing this in English today. This is our first time this is now our third year, as I mentioned. This is the first time that we're doing one of our panels in English. And this is one of an important step for us, for Mitsidi as an international consultancy company, as we now have offices in Canada and in Brazil. We have one of our offices in Alberta, Canada since the beginning of 2023. And we also have our more historical office in São Paulo, Brazil since 2014. And today we have a lot of communications with a lot of clients and partners all over the globe. So we have decided this year to do some of our panels in English and have some international guests here with us, so that we can reach a wider audience and also discuss different subject matters that wouldn't be possible just in Portuguese and with people only from Brazil. So I would like to give a very warm welcome to our guests who are here with us today. We have Mariana Weiss, who is an economist with a master's and a doctorate's degree in energy planning by the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, UFRJ. And nowadays she works as an energy research analyst at the Energy Research Office of Brazil, EPE, Empresa de Pesquisa Energética, where she's responsible for the modeling of the residential sector energy demand and also the agenda on energy poverty. She's also worked at the Inter-American Development Bank, the IDB, the World Bank, and also energy research offices of FGV, the Getúlio Vargas Foundation, and also at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. Hi, Mariana. So good to have you here with us. Next, we have also here with us Marcelo Andrade, Managing Director at Lucalex Holdings. Marcelo is an immigrant entrepreneur, Brazilian, who lives in Canada, who embarked on a journey to Canada back in 1999. So it's 24 years ago, right, Marcelo? And his career has taken him through diverse paths, leading him to a profound understanding of the Canadian business landscape and also profound understanding of the Brazilian landscape and culture. So he's here with us today also to bring this bridge between our two cultures. And last but definitely not least, we have Dr. David Bressler, who has spent the last 20 years working in the renewable energy and biorefining space with a focus on carbon reduction and long-term sustainability. So Dr. Bressler has run a large research program at the University of Alberta and has been very active in leadership roles for provincial and national research networks, as well as on the innovation front with spin-out companies and participation in provincial, national, and international venture funds, accelerators, and incubators. He's also currently the Associate Dean STEM Research for the College of Natural and Applied Sciences at the U of A, the University of Alberta, that encompasses the faculties of engineering, science, and agricultural, life, and environmental sciences. So we have a few different backgrounds here, a lot of work on fuels, biofuels, and also energy. We'll be talking about that in a little while, right, David? And Mariana working very, very strongly with energy. So I'm just presenting myself really quickly. My name is Alexandre Chikinazi, Alex. I'm the technical director here at Mitsidi. Mitsidi is an energy transition think tank. We provide advisory services and try to work with organizations, public and private, third sector all around the world to help advance the energy transition agenda. And this debate is one of the things that we try to do, which is circulate ideas, have different people talking and debating critically what are the ways forward in terms of the energy transition. So I'd like to welcome all of you one more time and start by asking some overarching questions, and then I'll hand each of you the floor so you can continue to introduce yourselves and talk a little bit about your background, and also keep in mind and bring your opinion about these general questions. So we can all get into the same language here. So we can all keep it about 8 or 9 minutes each, and then we'll go into the debate part of the panel. So I'd like to start by establishing a common definition. Okay, I mean, we're talking about the energy transition. There are many different ways to see what the energy transition can be. So my first question is, what do you consider the energy transition to be? And how do you believe it's perceived in your region, in your country, in your province, and the people around you? And on the other hand, what are some of the main challenges to the energy transition globally, and specifically in your country and in your region? And here we're considering all different aspects. We can go to the socioeconomic side, political, organizational, cultural aspects of each of your countries. So common definition, what is the energy transition? What do you see as some of the main challenges? And whatever you want to add in terms of your background and a little bit of your stories. Mariana, would you like to begin?
Sure, Alexandre. First of all, I'd like to thank Mitsidi for organizing this event, and also to inviting APE for joining. And I think that it's very interesting to have also representatives from Canada. I think that Brazil and Canada are countries with much things in common. Despite being in a different development stage, both countries are countries with continental territories and with an electrical matrix that is marked by renewable sources. So I'm sure that we can contribute with this exchange of experience, and maybe in the future create a great space for establish new partnerships. So after this, I'd like to talk about the vision of EPE to energy transition and what we think. So the world nowadays is in a decarbonization race to mitigate climate change. So energy transition is a way that the energy sector can contribute for the achievement of this global goal that it's mitigating emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, and having a better world with net zero emissions. So the International Energy Agency estimates already an investment of $1.7 trillion to be invested in clean energy technologies. And since 2018, the investments in clean energy have exceeded the investments in non-renewable sources. The difference and this difference has been continued to increase in the last years. Most parts of this investment is now concentrated in developed economies and in China. And this is one of the main challenges that we also saw for the case of developing economies as Brazil, that it's the attraction of investments. So besides of that, we recognize that Brazil is in a privileged position for energy transition, as we have already one of the largest and more solid interconnected electrical grids in the world, and also a matrix with high participation of renewable sources. That it's a result of our extensive experience also with energy auctions, so we can like drive investments, and also it's a result of the efforts that policymakers have developed in the country in order to try to overcome financial constraints and continue in this path of increasing renewable sources in the country. And we see that the energy transition is a big opportunity to improve this sustainable comparative advance that Brazil already has. And the main challenge is to address how to address these investment attractions, and also how to mitigate energy poverty, and also how to decarbonizing key industries that we have in our country, and also how to decarbonize the transport sector. One other challenge that we see is the need for skilling and reallocating workforce that nowadays it's mainly located like in the oil and gas industry. In that way, the Brazilian government is already demonstrating proactiveness to preserve this competitive advance and to overcome those challenges. And the way that the government is doing this is to creating some policies and programs that can help in this trajectory. So the government recently announced the new growth acceleration program, the PAC, that it's a plan that expects to bring investments of more than 150 million reais to renewable energy, power plants, and transmission lines till 2026. And also, we are facing the modernization of important fundings in Brazil, that is the Amazonia Fund and the Climate Fund. And we have also some new national policy and regulation strategies that we are working on, that is the ecological economic transition agenda, the National Energy Transition Plan, the program Fuel of the Future, and the National Hydrogen Program. And also we have been discussing about the implementation of a carbon market in Brazil. So the goal of those initiatives is to align incentives and establish market design to encourage investment and invest in efficient and clean technology in the future in our country. Besides of that, we have like still a big challenge in terms of decarbonization that we recognize, that it's the oil and gas industry that is related to this industry actually. And Brazil has a powerful and competitive oil and gas industry nowadays that is responsible for a representative part of the Brazilian GDP and also for the job creation in the country. Therefore, we see that it's crucial that this energy transition thinks how to transform and how to include this industry in this decarbonization program process. And also, that means that how we can change the portfolio of these companies and how to recapacitate and allocate this workforce, and also how to adapt the production matrix considered in those industry, and also in industry that use oil and gas as productive inputs. So in that way, we have already advanced. We don't have already like the answer, the complete answer, but in this year, Petrobras, that is the biggest national oil and gas company of Brazil, released a new energy transition department that seems to be like a very good sign for this agenda. And finally, there is one other challenge that we'd like to highlight here, besides of the financial issue and the oil and gas complexity. We have also the question that it's related to the fact that Brazil is a still developing country. It's that we have still in Brazil a high socioeconomic inequality. And the government nowadays has been, nowadays, the government it's trying to focus on solve this problem and to improve the access to energy to all the population. So nowadays we are close to achieving universal access to electricity in Brazil. More than 99.5% of the population have access to electricity, but we still have people without access to some essential electricity service, and also people that don't have access 20 hours per day to electricity. And other question that we also have noticed, it's that we still have a problem concerning fuels for cooking that strictly it's related also with the situation of climate change. And what we see that we still have people and households that use firewood for cooking, and sometimes this firewood is used in technology that are very inefficient and that can create can be prejudicial for the personal development, and also can create some different health diseases. So the most part of this population nowadays is concentrated in remote zones, most of them in Amazonia region. And one other initiative of the government is taking for address this problem, it's creating the program of Energia da Amazônia that aims to solve this energy poverty issue in the region, focusing mainly on clean technologies and energy sources. So in summary, Brazil is in a favorable position for energy transition. We see that we have already a strong dissemination of clean energy sources in our matrix. However, we still have some challenge, mainly in attracting investment and descarbonization key industry and addressing energy poverty issue. But the government is taking a very proactive role in this path in order to have like a safe and continuous energy transition that is aligned with our net zero goal. So I think that this is like a summary of we thoughts for the meeting today, and that's it, Alexandre.
It was a very wide question with a lot to talk about. Definitely. Thank you, Mariana. That was a very, very complete summary of some of the main challenges that we've been facing in Brazil, and also at the same time, a look at what progress is being made, what are the initiatives and programs that are being planned. So you talked a lot about continental dimensions, mobility issues, the high socioeconomic inequality, the energy access challenge that we have, financial issues, a big one, which is the oil and gas industry being responsible for such a large portion of jobs and economy in Brazil. I think that's actually a good bridge to bring it over to David, because that's also a big reality in Alberta. So thank you so much for all of those considerations. So David, I wanted to pass the word on to you. Please correct me if David is correct, or if it's Dr. Bressler is more adequate. In Brazil, we end up having the informality, but please let me know.
David works for me. I'm pretty flexible, so whatever's most comfortable.
So I want to pass the word on to you, and so start by establishing a little bit of what you consider the energy transition, how I believe it's perceived in Canada and Alberta, and then go on with the main challenges. The floor is yours.
Okay, so I think the Canadian standpoint is Canada is very engaged in kind of sustainability and carbon reduction. I think we're one of the most outspoken countries in terms of striving to the 2050 guidelines of zero emissions. And the federal government has come up with many targets within that realm, 2035 goals. We have a new clean fuel standard that increasingly is asking for decarbonization of fuels, electrification along those pathways. I think the important thing to understand, when we're considering Canada, like Brazil, it's a resource-based economy in many ways. There's lots of other industry there as well, but it's really important to our GDP. In Canada, one unique distinction for some jurisdictions is the federal government sets a lot of the policy around environment and general welfare, whereas the provinces, being a confederation, kind of have the control of the resource sectors. And so there's always a creative friction between the provinces wanting to decarbonize. Both provinces and the federal government have the zero emission 2050 goal, but I would say the province is more focusing on supporting the traditional industries and decarbonizing them, whereas the federal government is a little bit more on a complete transition from carbonaceous feedstocks, if that makes any sense. So there's a lot of debate in the news every day about the impact on the oil sands and transportation sectors, and maybe Marcelo has more to say on that. I think from my standpoint, what gets very interesting is that Brazil and Canada have a lot of compatibility. We talk about, we're almost in the same time zone, which is nice from my standpoint. For 20 years working in this space, it's nice. I was just in Brazil 2 weeks ago for a week. I was hosted by the Chamber of Commerce for the Brazil, Canada. So there's a lot of 50 years of connectivity that, could be built upon in that space. So what I observed when I was there is, I was in Sao Paulo, was in Paraná, and I looked at some of the industries there. There's a lot of analogies between what we see in Alberta, everything from the beef industry to energy to total sustainability of our resource bases. I think, and it's also important to note that for those that follow international politics, there was something called mission innovation, where all the countries of the world are looking at investments in energy, trying to move sustainability forward. And it's of note that, Brazil, China, India, and Canada are the 4 leads on the biofuels platform within mission innovation. And so that is articulating, you've got big land bases, you've got a lot of resources, forestry, agriculture across the world. And for 20 years, I've marveled at Brazil's ability to move ethanol as one of the first generations. And, there's some huge inherent advantages with that. I think as we look forward, though, just to put it on the table, where Canada has gone on a national stance is putting in a carbon tax. And so we're looking at a carbon tax on energy across the system right now. And what we're seeing is that's due to increase almost yearly going forward. And it's uncharted territory to look at what that will do to inflation indirectly and public policy over the next few years. But that we're fairly aggressive on that front. I would say, as I mentioned, Canada came forward with a clean fuel standard, which is, ratcheting up the carbon efficiency expected from our transportation fuels. And in parallel with that, we're seeing a renewed focus over the last few years, which is kind of my domain in some ways, is on the sustainable aviation front as well. So there is some markets, vehicle transport to and from work within a city makes sense to electrify quickly. The long haul transport, marine, aviation are all sectors that require other solutions, at least in the next decade or so. Given that if you buy a Boeing or Airbus plane today, that engine's expected to be used for the next 35 years, and you can't just flop engines or to another source. So those are sectors that require, renewable options, which is kind of where I work. But you also seeing huge investments in electrification, technology pushes, but paralleling that on the national stage, increasingly ratcheting requirements to reduce the carbon footprint, and still keeping in mind all of the other sustainable functions. The one other thing that hasn't been mentioned is, at least in Alberta, there's a big push on carbon capture and sequestration, which is a little bit unique in our jurisdiction. Huge investments, and actually, hundreds of millions of dollars of projects going in looking at carbon capture. But on parallel to that, You have extensive pipeline networks, and some of them have adopted into hydrogen already. So I would say from the research R&D world I come from, definitely on the Alberta agenda and federal agenda, hydrogen is one of the big growth areas that is being investigated. So I would say the Canadian standpoint from my perspective is all in. On one hand, you've got the government ratcheting pressure to reduce carbon. You've got the innovation system and the federal and provincial governments investing in technology solutions for reducing carbon, helping transition existing industries as best as possible. And then at the end of the day, looking at a balanced portfolio across the space. I think one of the things that we're seeing some discussion, I don't know if it's pushback at this stage, is I think it's inherent upon us to be responsible and look at the full life cycle assessment of all the technologies. So we know strategically, globally, people are looking at rare minerals, really important components for our battery systems and others, and geopolitics will rear its head at some point in time. But as we look at, the mining, the impacts, the cars, I think we're still talking even on photovoltaics and electrification of cars, what's the life cycle assessment on a battery? Are we going to be able to scale up the electrical grids to be able to handle the level of electrification anticipated? And, what happens in 5 years when batteries start losing their power? So we've got some solutions required in terms of recycling and an entire industry in terms of dealing with those things coming, I think. But it's challenges ahead. So I think from my perspective, there's huge opportunities. That's why I was in Brazil for collaboration and conjunction. I think the students, I have 2 Brazilian grad students in my group right now that started quite a few years ago. So this isn't a new thing. I think as we look at the 2 countries, although, in different areas, they have different development levels, but even Canada has very northern communities that are still in heating oil. Electrical grids are problematic very far in the north. And so we look at that. And then I think the only other 2 elements that are in the Canadian ecosystem that haven't been brought up to date is there's a huge push provincially, federally, and at every institution to look at things around reconciliation with Indigenous populations, First Nations. How are they part of the solution? How are they going to benefit and be an active partner in a socially conscious way as we transition our energy systems? And then finally, in Canada, like much of the world, there's a lot of discussion of, in the Canadian language, is equity, diversity, and inclusivity. How do we make sure that all these transitions are done in an equitable manner? That basically raises all of the society up in a fair and just manner. So it's all of the above all the time, and it's in the newspapers every day in one form or another, looking at the creative friction between the provincial governments, the federal governments. Everybody has the same goal, but I think there's always discussions on the best pathway to get there. From my standpoint, as a technology, it's my job to put as many options on the table as we can. And from there, we'll look at the policy programs and partnerships, which one we can move forward. So I'll probably hold it off there and then get into more specific questions. But if that's a good drive-by shooting introduction, that works. So.
Perfect, David. Thank you so much. Yes, that was also a very, very good overarching summary of what's going on in Canada right now. So you did bring some new points on the carbon capture and storage and the hydrogen. We can get back to that later on the Brazilian side to see what's being done. I think there is something that's very, very specific to Canada, which is what you said in the end, in terms of the considerations on the Indigenous populations. So I was surprised when I was in Canada to see how strong that aspect is in Canada. It's dealt with in a very different way than what I see in Brazil. But that also in a way links to something that Mariana said, even talk about the oil and gas industry, which is how to make this all equitable, how to look at the people who are in certain either states of vulnerability or that they will be in jobs that will be phased out or anyway. So how can we look at people when we're doing the energy transition and make sure that everyone's accounted for? I think that's one big overarching question that hangs over what some of the things that both of you had said. So he talks a lot about fuel, which makes a lot of sense in a country of proportional dimensions, and also I know you have a lot of background on that. So okay, so now let's get to Marcelo, and then we'll go back with some specific questions for each. So Marcelo, just putting back there the question that I asked for each one. So if you want to talk about how you understand the energy transition, especially because you're not coming from the energy sector, different from Mariana and David. So How do you as a business person, as a citizen, see the energy transition, and what do you perceive in your position as some of the main challenges to energy transition globally, in Brazil and in Canada, within your own frame of vision?
Perfect. No, thank you very much, Alexandre. It's a pleasure to be here. A little bit intimidated, I'm not going to lie to you, because I'm the one that understands less about energy in the whole group here. So in order to provide a little bit of color and background to what I'm going to say, and let me spend 2 minutes here just talking a little bit about my background. So I've been touched by energy at different points of life, but without ever being centered around energy. So the first time actually was when I was back at university. So I'm originally from Brazil, and I studied mechanical engineering at the Aeronautics Institute of Technology in São José dos Campos in Brazil. And one of my teachers at university was one of the guys that invented the ethanol engine. Right? So that was the team, that's where the ethanol engine was created, was at ITA. Right. So I was at the class. A guy was, maybe in his 70s. I was when I was 19. And it was such a privilege to be there. Right. So when I came to Canada a few years later, I actually studied economics. So I went from engineering to economics. So I came to the University of Toronto, did a master's in economics, and I went to work for a bank. So I was with the Royal Bank of Canada, now called RBC. And I was the manager of country risk for Latin America, which was very interesting because, for example, I remember very clearly when we were involved in a financing of a pipeline in Egypt. So this little department at the bank, what we did was, the bank can't know about everything happening everywhere. So the banks usually take a little piece of a syndicated loan made by, let's say, JP Morgan or Goldman Sachs makes a giant financing. And then they turn around and they sell pieces or tranches of that investment to other people. But whoever is buying needs to understand what are the risks. So the banks have these small departments which are assessing country risk. So for a couple of years here in Toronto, I was the guy that had to explain to Canadian executives about risks in Brazil. That was a long time ago. That was the first time when Lula was still a candidate. For the first time he became elected. So that was like 2000, 2001. Okay? And well, that's a little bit of the background. Then I went on, I was a commercial banker for many years, lending money to businesses here in Toronto and in region, until I started to, at HSBC Bank then, which is very international, I started to see a lot of international clients coming to Canada. So what we did years ago, I quit my job and I set up a business helping foreign companies that come to Canada. Okay, so that's a bit of the background. So what I want to talk about, what I see here, and it's a good coincidence, David, I hope you liked, I was in Curitiba 3 days ago as well. Like I was in Sao Paulo, I landed yesterday, coming back from Brazil. First time since 2019, I went to visit family mostly this time. But these are a few things that I noticed. And David, you correct me if I'm wrong here. The demographic density is way bigger down there. Like you are in a crowded place all the time in Brazil. Very different feeling when in July I stayed in Canmore and went to bed. It's like here you don't feel that intensity of people all around you. The other thing that you feel very clearly here, not this time of the year, which is beautiful, October, but like if you come in January, February, you understand how energy has been front and center in the mind of every Canadian since the beginning of times, right? When the First Nations had to sew a good pair of moccasin shoes, you better do a good job. Otherwise, your feet are going to fall off, right? From frostbite and whatnot. You needed to know how to take care of the exhaust fumes from your longhouse, from your First Nation longhouse. Otherwise, the smoke would kind of suffocate everybody sleeping inside. These are concerns that Brazilians never needed to have because of you had other problems. You're worried about poisonous snakes and all other stuff that we didn't have to worry about here. But like the mentality about energy specifically, you don't have a house in Canada that doesn't have some type of heating system, right? In Brazil, you have hot temperatures in many places, and only maybe in the last 10 years, people started to actually have a lot of air conditioning in the houses, right? There's a funny thing here that I don't know our audience, if it has more Brazilians or Canadians or others, but here's the thing, right? I tell this, Brazilians laugh about this, David. Like, I remember my kids going to daycare here in Toronto, and here are the rules, you know, they don't let very young children play outside at extreme weather temperatures. But here's the definition of what's extreme to a Canadian. Until -10 Celsius, it's okay. Your 2-year-old kid can play outside without a problem if it's -8. Even if their gloves fell off, somebody will put that. That's okay. But God forbids you have like a heating sensation above 30 degrees. Everything is shut down. Everybody's inside. Like, temperature reaches 25, you start to see everywhere people be careful, hydrate yourself, watch out. So it's a very different relationship that we Canadians have with the environment that surrounds us, because literally our environment can kill us if we don't have the right energy in place, right? So I think that, and so that was the first thing. The other thing is, yes, we are a very blessed country naturally through our minerals and whatnot, but for 6 months of the year, we're not harvesting much. So what that caused in the brains of early Canadians since forever is, you better plan. You have a leaky roof in September, you know you have 30 days to get that fixed. Otherwise, you're going to die in December, January, if the water starts to come in. So timelines, planning, technical expertise, solving your problems by innovating, creating a plan, and executing on schedule are not virtues that Canadians have because they are great human beings and people from... No, it's... If you didn't do that, you would die in the winter. It's very simple. And even things like collaboration, right? Here in Canada, everybody has a story where they helped a neighbor or they needed a neighbor's help. Even when you travel in the winter, your neighbor's gonna... my neighbor shovels my snow here in my driveway. Because if not, I can get in the house when I'm back. And I reciprocate the other way around. So the idea of collaboration is also stronger. The idea of community is also stronger. So I just want to spend a few minutes talking about how the harsh weather shapes the way people unconsciously behave in the society. And that's very powerful. And for me, it was even more clear because I arrived from Brazil just about 30 hours ago. I spent like 17 days in Brazil. And the differences became even more clear. I had not gone to Brazil in almost 4 years, so some of these differences were kind of opaque in my brain, but they're very clear now. And okay, so where are we in terms of energy transition in Canada? I think a lot of the similar things that Mariana mentioned, that David, Dr. Bressler mentioned, yes, we have to be very careful about not killing existing nice paying jobs for hardworking people, but nobody's putting their hands in the sand pretending climate problems don't have to be addressed. And I mean, the whole issue about carbon taxes and all that is very, of course, you have the political discourse all about that, because, you know, once you increase taxes, you are kind of removing money from people's houses, but then you're using those taxes to pay for other things. So how to do things is where we see differences in Canada. But nobody disagrees that they want the best. Everybody, I mean, nobody in Canada is in politics to getting themselves richer. Nobody is in Canada because of things that have nothing to do with their own view of the world. The different politicians are in politics because they believe in their way of see things, and they think certain problems have to be addressed from this angle, not from that angle. That's where you see the difference. So I think that is a great thing that I really love about Canada, is that everybody who's in public service, they may disagree on a lot, but they agree. Nobody forgets who they're there to serve. Everybody talks about the taxpayer money, jobs, the society. And so that's something I admire a lot about the Canadian society and the way of do things and businesses and all that. So where we are in the energy transition, yes, we have parts of the political spectrum that think the way it's more like to go and increase the carbon taxes. The other one, no, don't do taxes, but let's find something else. And yeah, there's all this noise about how to get things done, for sure. But everybody agrees that innovation brings the solution. So you have government funding money, and you have the big oil companies doing research on clean energies, right? And so everybody understands the path goes through innovation. Everybody understands the path goes to preserving jobs, generating better lives for everybody. And as Canadians, everybody understands the importance of energy. I think that's a main difference between Brazil and Canada when energy, what I see from the energy standpoint. Energy for Brazilians, it's kind of an afterthought. People are not kind of focused. If you don't work in the area, it's not something like in Canada, if it's February and your furnace breaks, you're going to see how quickly energy becomes a priority in your brain. You know, every Canadian understands the importance of energy like 10 times better than the average Brazilian, for sure. And then how we solve the problems is through innovation and collaboration. I don't know, that's my view as a lay person who's not from the energy, but more as a business person, immigrant myself. I'm in Canada for 24 years with 2 sons born and raised here, both at university now. And I just came from a Brazil trip. So that's my perspective as a citizen, as a business owner.
If I could jump in quickly, I would just add one comment. Marcelo's comment on the minus 10 degrees, that's an Easterner where the humidity is higher. In Alberta, where it's dry, is probably closer to minus 20. But other than that, I'll
That is really impressive. And Marcelo, you had nothing to be afraid of in the beginning. Thank you for bringing such an interesting approach and a historical approach, a cultural approach. And it's so important when we're in, you know, our companies, we're surrounded by engineers and architects and and people who are only speaking technical language. There's so much that goes on beyond those walls that are so crucial to everything that happens in the technical world, and sometimes we're not looking at that. So that's one of the reasons we wanted to have you here, and thanks so much. That was an incredible contribution. I switched places with the two of you because 2 weeks ago I was in New York, so not in Canada, but so we crossed in the skies at some point, and I had actually an experience very similar to what you just said, Marcelo. First of all, I was talking to I was going by a school and I was talking to the directors at the school, and they were saying that, well, New York is not Toronto and definitely not Edmonton, so there the threshold is 0 degree. But they said that so above freezing, kids will go outside, definitely. Below freezing, maybe not, but down to 0 degrees, there's no question. So 32 degrees Fahrenheit, there's no question that they'll be outside. And another thing that I noticed, which has to do with what you said, Marcelo, in a certain way, is that it was end of summer. Temperatures outside were still pretty high, let's say around 27, 28, 30, 32 Celsius. And nobody would open the windows ever. Every single place I went to had very strong air conditioning. And whenever I wanted to open a window, people would look at me like I was an alien. What are you doing? Why are you opening the windows? If we have the capacity to control the weather indoors, why would you subject yourself to the outdoor conditions? Because the outdoor conditions are nice right now, and we can, you know, save energy by doing that. So it's funny that on one hand, energy became maybe even more and more crucial. You know, as people were able to control it better and better, it went into people's comfort levels. So people are not comfortable with temperatures above 20 degrees, 21 degrees indoors. Whereas in Brazil, we can, you know, it could be 24, 25, and it's fine in a lot of places. But on the other hand, that has also led to a culture of a lot of unnecessary energy usage, because maybe then we can go into another side, which has to do with financial availability and the possibility to control the climate, which is maybe of course, generalizing, but in Brazil, a lot of people will end up using less air conditioning in order to spend less, and they're not thinking about the climate change. They're just thinking about how expensive it is. And at least where I was in New York, let's just keep it cool inside. Not really worrying. Of course, this is a very, very big generalization. We have all kinds of populations in all of these countries. But I think just to bring a little bit of the cultural aspect. But I did want to jump into the next question now for all of you. Also taking a bridge on something that you said, Marcelo, about the collaboration and the organization, right, of society as a whole. I grew up in New York, so going there was not the first time I was there. I grew up in negative temperatures, and I also had this strong impression of the differences of society's organization in New York versus in Brazil. I was there on 9/11, for example, and I saw how everything went down, and people would get out of their cars to help, orient traffic on the streets, and everyone respected that. And everyone respected one car went at a time and everything. And so the organization of societies, I feel it very different in Canada and Brazil. And I was in June in Edmonton for the Alberta Energy Efficiency Summit. And there also I was able to, take a quick peek. I wrote a little bit about it on my LinkedIn. A quick peek at how the energy sector organized itself. And I saw a lot of collaboration among the different stakeholders in industry, but without the necessity of someone to organize them. So in Brazil, we have a lot. Well, I'm going to ask the question actually to you guys. So maybe David, you can start, and then Mariana, you can go next, and then Marcelo. I wanted to talk a little bit about how you see the public awareness and sensitivity to the energy transition. So one thing, we're talking about government and everything, but how does the general public see the necessity of the energy transition? But also in terms of how society and industry in the energy sector organizes itself. Where does the funding come from? Are people waiting for an answer to come from outside, or are they organizing themselves to move forward? What is the relationship between the different stakeholders perceived in Canada when we're talking about the energy sector and taking action? And Mariana, after that, how do you see that in Brazil? David.
So just starting generally, energy affects everything. And so in Canada, at the risk of being risky, I think it's all a little bit fluid right now. I think if you go back over the last 5 to 10 years, the government was very committed to go down these paths. The industry is very supportive. Very large multinational energy companies were saying all the right things, moving in the right direction. I think one thing that's been happening over the last year is, as the cost of the carbon tax is coming in, prices are escalating. Two things are happening in Canada that appear to be related, unrelated. One is we're getting a lot of inflation, like a lot of the world, that we're unused to. Interest rates are tracking up. Housing availability, due to large rates of immigration, are putting pressure on that market. It's expensive and hard to build housing. So the whole system kind of comes to a swirling matrix of life is getting more and more expensive, and people are getting more and more focused. Over the last definitely 6 months, the average voter is getting intensive on, how can I ever buy a house if I'm a young person? How do I, have a quality of life? The carbon tax is being associated with the carbon reduction. So on one hand, all the directions are moving to, zero emissions by 2015. Everybody agrees on that. The path to get there, the carbon tax is, I would say, somewhat topical right now, and it's due to keep going up. And so I would say we have opposition parties that are tightly tying it to inflation and to the cost of living and the inability to buy a house. And how do you build the house, and how do you make the house more energy efficient, going to the other side of the equation, and the added cost of photovoltaic or solar cells, So I think it's all tying together right now. And I would say it's a little bit of an unstable time almost, where the mission is still going ahead, the policies are still rolling out. But I would sense there's a rising frustration within the chats and the online newspapers, looking at, what does this all mean? And are people really now understanding the costs associated with this pathway. And so I think as we look forward, we'll need some technology interruptions on various fronts to reduce the cost of some of these stages. My personal belief is if we just implement everything and cut everything without any technology support, I don't think it's going to be sustainably supported by the population seeing step back in quality of life. I think we're going to have a two-pronged approach to keep the pressure, to keep the targets going, but we're going to need the innovation and the investments in as was said, helping transition our societies and our industries to still have a reasonable GDP and not have inflation rates approaching some other countries in the world. And to put this in context, I mean, in Canada, if we have a target of 2% inflation, and we had interest rates down below 2% for quite a while. Now interest rates for mortgages are about 5% and drifting up a little bit, and inflation is buoyed between 4 and 8%, depending on the metric, and that is starting pressure. So I know there's countries in the world and in South America that would laugh at those rates, but that is the political dialogue right now these days. And putting pressure on companies. And we are seeing multinational energy companies, especially major ones in Alberta, saying we need to focus on core business and return to shareholders more than they would have said 2 years ago. So it is starting to become a little bit more of a debate than it was even, I would say, 12 months ago. And definitely before we had the war in Ukraine, that has kind of kicked off a whole bunch of elements. And especially being in Alberta, and Alberta being in many ways an energy superpower with shale, oil, gas, bitumen reserves, the world's looking for how they can get access to those energy reserves. And our federal government policies are at contrast with how the province would like to engage on that, if I'm being polite on that. So I would say still to be determined where this all sorts out over the next 12 months to a year. And I hope I'm not being too cryptic, but there is a lot of, I would say, tension in the system right now, both politically and, for people going to buy groceries, seeing prices going up is not something people have been accustomed to for the last decade or so. So there's some pressure. And the carbon tax affects everything across the board, from shipping to storage to primary producer. One of the more topical areas that's been broached but hasn't been implemented is looking at reducing emissions from agriculture and fertilizer use. So that's one as another political hot box with the provinces versus the feds on what to move forward on that. And if you start impacting food production, again, pricing inflation becomes very real for kind of the most impoverished sides of your society, if that makes sense. So I'll throw those landmines out there and see how Marcel and others want to pick up that gauntlet.
Mariana, do you want to comment and talk about a little bit, throwing a little bit of a question together with that? So specifically about Brazil's energy and electricity sector, and the industry, the way society and industry organize itself. How do you see that Brazil's way of organizing contributes to the energy transition, or what challenges does the current governance of the electricity sector and the energy sector bring to the energy transitions? Are different stakeholders coming together, trying to build something together, or do you see a lot of conflicting interests?
Okay, in this case, I think that we are in advanced too, because we have a really robust governments nowadays, and a good communication between the institutions. So from my point of view, that I am in the energy planning company, we see that a lot, because the energy planning is compromised with an integrated view of energy transition. So we have a very good communication between the stakeholders and the policymakers that are inside the energy sector. And we have also a good communication with, for example, the economy ministry and environmental ministry. Of course, we have some challenge in this communication, But I think that we are trying to move on and improve this communication to have a consensus and have even more solid energy planning in the future. It's that? What do you think?
Yeah. So let me jump back to David on that aspect, and then we'll hear a little bit from Marcelo and come back to you. So in terms of what Mariana brought a little bit about communication and the governance of the energy and electricity sector, when I was in Alberta, I heard a lot of discussion, for example, on demand-side management policy. So jumping now a little bit more specific. And what I heard is some of the utility companies saying that they wanted to implement demand-side policy, the demand-side management programs, but the regulators had not regulated or created legislation in that sense, and the utilities were not allowed to innovate without the consensus and the regulation coming from the regulator. In Brazil, it's a little bit different in terms of I feel here that the utilities are a little bit less willing to go outside the lines and and innovate and bring demand side management. Mariana, afterwards, please, if you disagree or if you have an opinion, please go ahead. So it was interesting for me to see that the utilities were trying to push the market forward, and not industry itself. It was the utilities, but the regulator was not following up in their view. And then we know that the provincial government has one opinion, the federal government has a different opinion. So how do you see that the structure and the governance of the energy and electricity sector contribute in one way or pose challenges on another hand to energy policy, going forward?
I would say, with the first context, that this is not my deep expertise. My answer following that would be yikes. So I would say the answer is, in Canada, the electrical regulations is the provincial jurisdiction, as we talked about. So the federal system can put pressure on decarbonizing, etc. But we've seen even in Alberta over the last decade, there's been major provincial incursions into electrical supply and contracting that have, governments have moved in a direction on policy and then retracted and changed, and the taxpayers have been on the hook for in the billions of dollars kind of payouts in doing that. So it's a little bit charged. That's why I commented on yikes. I think the solution is, to get where we need to go, we're going to need, smart grids with the ability to load electricity up from remote and small production systems, having baseload compensation. It is a big mixing problem that we face. And so whether it's supply side or a very smart integrated, we've got the ability to handle big data and switching it, but it is a policy problem right now. And the companies are looking to make a profit still at the end of the day, and the government is trying to keep the lowest sustainable rate in a grid that's not browning out. And so I don't think there is an easy solution. And I think each province is navigating a little bit on their own right now. And if you're Quebec and have a hydro dam that takes care of most of your energy, it's very different than Alberta, that's in the middle of transitioning from coal to natural gas and now being told they need to get rid of natural gas very quickly. There's more friction again between federal policies and electrical. So as we know, coal was great because it's on demand and you could produce what you need. Natural gas isn't that much different. When you start talking, solar or tidal or photo, or wind especially is important in Alberta. Alberta's invested a lot in wind and photovoltaic, but at the end of the day, those are intermittent, and you need a baseline load to provide at times. And getting the right solution, I think the jurisdictions are all exploring different pathways. I'm being a little bit cryptic, but I would say there's been some, I don't want to call it failed policies, but expensive policies that have been experimented with. And I think there's a little bit of trepidation from being too aggressive in the next little while until we get the right recipe. I don't know, maybe it looks out east differently, Marcelo, but I would say it is a little bit tough right now.
So do you want to comment or compliment on that?
Sorry, me or Mariana?
Marcelo.
Marcelo, oh yeah. Well, my view as a taxpayer and as a voter, I have to take a step back here just to make something clear, I don't know if David is aware of that or not, but like Brazil doesn't have the same representative system that we have in Canada. What we have in Canada is that we have like electoral districts, right? We call ridings here. So essentially every politician is elected within a geographic area that represents, give or take, 100,000 voters. And that these are the only people that are going to vote for you in the next election. So let's say if I'm elected now, I have to make sure that 4 years from now, I have to come back to the same people that elected me now, so they can vote for me again. So that makes politicians really closely attached to the population's interests and needs. So you're going to have some of what David described, like the provincial versus the federal interest. I mean, it's tough sometimes to be from a riding where your political or federal political party wants a certain priority, but your local population is aligned in another direction. It's like some of these ridings are complicated for you as a politician running there. But what it causes to people is a very strong awareness that you're working for your people, because you don't need a big budget to be elected in the next election. If you are a local community guy, well-related, a business owner or something, and you want to run in the next election, and you do a good job, and maybe you can get rid of that incumbent that's been there for 25 years. Because again, you only need a small pool of people to know who you are and what kind of work you're doing. That's very different in Brazil, where you need massive budgets to be elected because you're elected from a pool in the whole state. And the states in Brazil have the population of Canada, some of them, right? So in Canada, it's like 100,000 people need to know what you're doing. And then you get elected. So that's the first thing that I think causes a massively big difference in terms of how politicians behave, in terms of day-to-day priorities from the people and from the businesses. Number one thing. Number two thing that I notice is that, especially now that I came back from Brazil like 30 hours ago, still in Brazil, it looks like the majority of people are waiting for somebody else to solve their problems. It's like, oh, the politicians don't do anything, or the big establishment doesn't do anything. I see in Canada a lot more self-organization, people taking stuff on their own. Let's go and make pressure in my local member of parliament, because they're not doing their job. So people write to their parliament, they go there, they go talk to people. So there seems to be in our system in Canada a lot more engagement from the society in trying to solve the big problems. So if I'm worried about my business is going to be hurt for a certain change in policy from federal or provincial government, I'm going to be calling the member of parliament, and I'm going to be calling like 20 of my friends that have the same problem that I have, and we're going to call directly together, right? So there is more self-organization from the society, from people and from businesses here to exert political pressure. That also creates a very interesting situation, which is on the technical side. Like David said, we're not going to get out of this without more technology, because people are not going to be willing to give up their lifestyle and pay more for stuff, right? Inflation is a real thing. Nobody wants to have their taxes raised. That's where we get pushed again towards innovation. Just like the First Nations had to sew a good quality moccasin shoes so their feet didn't freeze, we are used to that. We're used to have to go to look into innovation through collaboration, which is something that still baffles my mind after 24 years in Canada, how much collaboration there is in Canada between three parties, between businesses, the government, right, and the universities. So a business here, if they have a problem, they have no problem going to a university. And actually universities have whole departments in charge of managing relationship with the community and trying to find, oh, do you have a problem? We have a master's student here. We have PhD students. The universities are always looking for industry problems that they can solve with their knowledge, paid for with government funding. So the way these three things work together is really different from what we see in Brazil. So like every university professor here, at some point or another, they're working with industry. every industry lead here, at some point, they're working with academics. And everybody is always kind of talking and aware of government funding, grants, and all that kind of stuff. I see that in Brazil, it's much more common for you to just look at your own problem and trying to solve it yourself. Well, that's why you have gated neighborhoods, right? In Brazil, there's too much violence in the streets. Let's move into a gated neighborhood. In Canada, if there's too much violence in the street, people are going to be putting pressure on the government to make the violence go away so that everybody can live without walls. So it's just different ways to think. Anyways, don't know if I talked too much about energy on this one, but
Marcelo, thanks a lot. I'm going to hand it over to Mariana now and give you an opportunity to share your experiences with a lot of the different things that Marcelo brought culturally, right, in terms of society organization and all of that. I saw sometimes you were nodding, sometimes you were, there are some strong feelings, I think, in this. So on one hand, and after that, maybe you can also make the connection and talk about this collaboration of academia with universities and government and industry. So please, floor is yours.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with these points that we have like this valley between academia and industry. It's a shame, but we really face this in Brazil. But we have some initiatives that try to improve this relation. And one of those is the program of research and development that try to study like innovative topics in innovative topics using like the financing from the income of distributors. And normally like we have like a topic and we try to open this agenda, and sometimes we have like the contribution of the academia. So like this is one example of how we can reduce this valley between academia and industry, and that is already happening in Brazil. And other thing, like for me, it was very interesting to also the speech of David about demand response, that here in Brazil, we had an initiative to try to improve the energy response in the industry. It was like a pilot, and we had some industry that participate in. So I think that it can be a learning study for this case. And also we have the initiative of demand response for the residential sector, that is the Tarifa Branca. In that case, we had like a very small public that had adopt this kind of tariff here, probably due to a lack of information of the society, as we see normally those kind of initiatives when you use like opt-in solution that the consumer needs to say, oh, I want to join this program. Normally we had like, when we have like this voluntary system, normally we have a smaller adoption of this kind of problem, and this is what we have nowadays in Brazil. So I think, and this lack of information, it's an issue that we have in many parts of investments in energy efficiency, and also in demand response initiatives and new technologies in innovative solutions. We have like this fear, because also we have like a high uncertainty in the society. So yeah, I think that's I don't know if I answer all the points, but I'd like to bring like this study case that I think that it can illustrate some some advance that we had in Brazil. Another thing that I think that it's important to highlight also, it's that like here in Brazil, like the distributed generation has increased a lot in the last years. Nowadays we have like 16 kilowatt hour of installed capacity. And I think that this is a sign that people are interested to have renewable sources and have control of the energy that they are consuming, and also to understand more how like those kind of technology work. And we see this, like we see that people are investing on that, but also we know that there is a high incentive to people do this kind of investments. So anyway, my point of view is that, okay, we are a developing country with like this uncertainty issues, and also we have a high sensation of risk, you know, and we will have also a problem of income and inequality. So sometimes it's difficult to have like a real action in the direction toward these new technologies and these new solutions. So I don't know, I guess that's a campaign of disseminating information, like a continuous campaign, could help a lot to encourage and also to engage society in those new technologies and try to contribute more in energy transition.
So we have some questions from the people who are watching us, and one of them is has a lot to do with some of the things that you were talking about, Mariana. So let's start with that one. Question from Pedro Bittencourt from Green Ant. So happy that you're here watching us, Pedro. So Pedro was actually one of the panelists on Monday as well, very, very close partner and friend. So the Brazilian, he mentioned that the Brazilian Industrial Demand Side Management Program only had the enrollment of one company, and it was a company who never actually accepted any of the dispatch calls. Right. I know that EPE is currently working, very, very strongly on the demand side management programs. So in this pilot program, that's what happened. So in his opinion, it can be considered maybe a failure to provide the correct incentives because, it didn't actually work. So and then he's asking if, are there any incentives to participation of demand side in the Canadian energy flexibility markets? I just wanted to remind everyone that tomorrow we are going to have a panel specifically focused on demand side management, with one representative from Brazil, one from Chile, and one from the US and Canada. So we will be going more deeply into that tomorrow. So please be with us tomorrow. But if both of you want to comment on that, Mariana, a little bit about the experience here and these incentives, if that's in your area, and David also, if that's within your area and you want to comment on incentives for participation of demand side in Canadian energy flexibility markets, we can hear a little bit from both of you. So Mariana?
Yeah, as I said, there was this project of demand response in the industry, and it was like a pilot project. And we see that in the industry, industry still see those kind of programs with a high risk for their production process. So because in that way, as Marcelo said, they are very worried about their production, their main product, and sometimes they see this new kind of technology as a new risk to deal in this process. So, and also we need to think also that we have like a industrial structure that sometimes doesn't have also this flexibility to answer to a demand response program like that. So those are some challenges, like the informational part is a new one. But anyway, like in EPE, we are developing a project right now to understand each industries could have like a potential to adopt a demand response program, and how they could, and what should be like the design of this kind of project, this kind of program, to increase the interest of the industry to participate in.
Okay, thank you, Mariana. And this project, also just sharing that this is one of the projects that Mitsidi had the opportunity to participate in, together with another partner company, which is PSR. And PSR will be tomorrow present in this debate on demand-side management. And Mitsidi we were able to go in and really investigate some of what Mariana said regarding the industry's flexibility and willingness to participate in these programs. So yeah, it's a lot of work to do, and a lot of work is being done. I'm very, very excited for tomorrow's debate. But David, would you like to comment on the incentives for demand side?
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add. It's not like it's a big part of our grid where they're advertising. There's been efforts to try and do policy to allow on-ramping of other sources. But I would say it's a bit of a hot potato right now, looking at back and forth in the grid and how to do it sustainably. And the incentives aren't really in a good place to do it effectively. It's in a recognized area, I think, of concern. And a lot of it is, as I mentioned, getting back to the smart grid technology so we can properly have those flipping and enabling of uploading as needed. But right now, it's not my area of expertise, so it's not been a big topical area. I don't know if Marcelo might have more expertise in this area. You might be a better answer than me.
Okay, so so Pedro, come back tomorrow for this panel specifically on this. U.S., Canada, Chile, Brazil. We'll be talking a lot about that. I want to jump into another question that we got, and I'd like to start with Marcelo with your less technical approach, and then go to David and back to Mariana. Rosane Fukuoka's question is how to boost the energy transition in an economy that has a strong industry of oil and natural gas. I know that the oil and gas industry is more focused. Now, this is my words. Is more focused in more in the West, especially in Alberta, a bit of Saskatchewan. But also looking at the numbers, the oil and gas, the revenue that comes into the country from oil and gas exports coming from Alberta is responsible for a very, very large proportion of the revenue coming into Canada as a whole. So it's not only important for Alberta, it's important for the entire country. So that's a great question from Rosane. And I want to also complement the question when it gets to you, Mariana. So how to boost the energy transition in an economy that has a strong industry of oil and natural gas, but also how to boost the energy transition in an economy that has a very large proportion of renewable energies, such as Brazil, and the water source. Because on the other hand, doesn't that also take away the sense of urgency and, oh, we've done enough, we're renewable enough, why do we need to do more? So there's this dual aspect, but let's focus first on Rosane's question about oil and natural gas, but keeping in mind also the opposite question. So Marcelo, please.
Oh, thank you. What I see, right, because I am based in Toronto, but my business helps companies establish in Canada whatever it makes more sense for them. For example, Mitsidi is in Alberta because it makes more sense for you guys to be there, right? What I see is beyond all the political, whatever, the cheap points that can be scored by politicians, looking beyond that, we see two things that are very clear. Yes, there are actions that need to be taken because the planet, is over here. I don't see people in Canada that are climate deniers saying, no, there's nothing going on. There's nothing, let's not do anything. I think everybody agrees there are things that need to be done. Again, it's in our Canadian DNA to innovate and look to do things better, has always been. So I think if you look at Alberta, you're going to hear that. You're going to find disagreements in terms of how to achieve that, right? Because also, if you ask people in Ontario and Quebec, It's not that you're going to find anybody that says, oh, we don't care about those jobs in Alberta. Let them lose their jobs and starve, right? I mean, it's not what it's about. Like everybody anywhere in the country understands two things. Yes, there is a transition happening, but also, yes, there are people that depend on it as it is today. And that cannot just be uprooted and kind of just bulldoze through it. And okay, too bad for them. They were doing the wrong thing at the wrong time. I mean, nobody. I see a sense of solidarity. I mean, beyond all the political cheap fighting, I see a sense of solidarity in the society that understands both sides, right? And I think that's what gives me hope. And again, I come back to that point. The way I see Canadians working with this is through a very well-oiled interaction among the three parties: the business, the academia, and the government, through these innovation programs, right? So they're incredibly creative. And again, David, you will know this way better than me, but I know from the news that a lot of the bigger innovation programs going on in Canada are now actually inside big oil companies and being developed and paid for by, research institutions. So this is how you use current prosperity to take care of a transition that's going to be good in the future for everybody. And this is nothing new in mankind, right? This transition from one thing to the next happened over and over. And the only ones that really didn't benefit from any of that were those that were just stuck in their old ways, saying, no, I'm a candle maker. I'm not gonna, electricity will never light our public streets. I mean, those guys are gone, right? But the guy that was a candle maker that knew very well who bought all the candles, had all the best databases of how many candles were bought, and these guys use more electricity. This guy probably could deploy his knowledge somewhere in the new electric distribution company, right? So I think this transition, for those that are smart, I mean, it's not going to happen smoothly or easily, but it's possible. And that's what I see as a society, that if we just step back before the political bickering, scoring cheap points to get elected.
Okay. So a lot of energy transition going on inside oil and gas companies, but then there's the political aspect on the other side. So David, floor is yours to talk about that, and feel free also if you want to tread into your very comfortable waters of biofuels and aviation, because I think that has everything to do also with this oil and gas topic.
Yeah, and I just to reiterate, I mentioned before, in Canada, the federal government has the gross controls. They talk about the environment, they talk about, overall policy, taxation. The province controls the electrical grid, the generation, the raw resource distribution, permitting, environmental. So with that context, what you see is the federal government increasing the ratchet on the carbon intensity. If left to its own devices, that would force the industry to shut down in some cases, like the oil sands, and some debate. I would say within the province and with the companies, that investments you're talking about, that's where they've gone full in, and we mentioned carbon capture and sequestration. So can you pull the energy off and stick the CO2 back in the ground? That's where you see the entrance of hydrogen. Is you could go from bitumen, make hydrogen in theory, and put the CO2 back underground, export hydrogen. And I think that's kind of where the province and some of the big players are going. But where it gets a little bit more interesting is you start to see transitions to elements of diversification, and bitumen beyond combustion is actually a program. So looking at how to use these heavy oils to make other consumer goods and needs that don't have carbon footprint. How do you, that's the other element that's out there swirling. But I would say, if you combine those systems together, where the debate happens is, okay, so Alberta would have the opportunity to export huge volumes of natural gas globally. Could send it out to places like China and Europe, which have energy sensitivities. You get a decoupling of the approach on that. Federally, they think that's still increasing emissions from the country. That's generally a bad thing. The alternative is you have countries like China opening coal mines or coal-fired electrical grids rapidly, which would be much better in the interim to offset with natural gas. But that's the raging debate you see within Canada between central jurisdictions and the province. The province would rather sell as much as they can, and if it's a better solution than coal, drive that, but our policy is to get to zero emission. Now, the only comment before throwing it over to Mariana, zero emission does not allow biofuels in the current context either, because the carbon emissions from production right through fertilizers and a true LCA, there is carbon emissions from agriculture, which means there's carbon emissions from your biofuels over and above just the carbon being captured in the crop. So depending on how you're doing the full LCA, everybody has to respond to get to zero. And the right way to do that in the fuel world will come with time, and carbon capture may be part of that. But that's, to many people, uncharted territory. What happens when you put that much gas that deep in the earth over time, right? So it's opening up more lines of discussion. We know fracking has been affiliated with some earthquakes with time. So there's that industry. There's a lot going on here, is the long short. But to get to the question, big energy in Alberta is looking at how to reduce their carbon footprint with technology. That's the resounding answer here. How do you do carbon capture? How do you strip the energy off as hydrogen? And people, some exotics are looking. We're back to looking at fuel cells with hydrogen feeds. We're looking at things like even nitrogen-based fuels, if you could imagine thinking about putting the hydrogen on nitrogen as a fuel source instead of the carbon, so you can take that through to extension. Those are kind of the out there, but I think the last one, and this is the political question more than a technology one, is people are back looking at nuclear. So there's countries that won't touch nuclear. There's other countries that are moving back in that direction. In Alberta, for example, people looking at small nuclear, so regional kind of approaches to help provide that electrical grid and some of the other energies. So there's some unresolved nuclear. Obviously, the emissions are much different than you would get from a carbon source, but it opens up other discussions down the road, right? And everybody's waiting for fusion, which is just always in the horizon, right? So I'll maybe in there.
Wow, such a wide spectrum of answers, and that does take us back to a parenthesis of a question that I asked in the beginning that nobody answered, but maybe for the better, because perhaps we would have debated for 2 hours what is the energy transition after all, and where the boundaries are set. So it's something going hydrogen. There's so many different colors of hydrogen. What one country considers, no, let's do blue hydrogen, let's do gray hydrogen. It's okay. Another country will say no, but that's against. David, you're comparing the exports to what the alternatives would be if these exports did not even exist. But the federal government is looking at it and saying no, but it's not clean. So yeah, where we set the boundaries, where we set the definitions, it's such an important point also in this debate. Thinking about the fact that there is no 100% perfect energy transition or 100% perfect, clean, absolutely zero emission. As you said, also, life cycle, if you just look at the crop, that's one thing. But if you look at the fertilizers, obviously have the emissions. So very, very good points that you brought. So Mariana, oil and gas.
I'd like to make a statement that it's like this is not the first energy transition that we'll face, and it won't be the last one. So the industry, the society will get used to these new deals that we'll decide in the future. And also, we need to have in mind that this diversification of the portfolio of the oil and gas companies, it's a gradual process. And also, I don't believe that we will live in a world that doesn't use any oil product at all. I think that actually we will develop other mechanisms, like, for example, carbon market or carbon capture. Also use with a more intensity new fuels. For example, the biofuels. For example, in Brazil, we use a lot already biofuels inside of gasolines and diesel. But one idea is maybe we can increase this participation in the energy matrix. And also we have the hydrogen, as our friends said. And it's that. I think that the path it's towards a more diverse world with other energy sources. There will be space to everyone.
And do you feel that Brazil's relatively clean electricity matrix, not as clean as it used to be maybe 20 years ago, but there was 90%, electricity from hydro sources, now, in the 60s. But do you feel that on the other hand might have slowed down Brazil's progress in terms of the sense of urgency?
Alexandre, I don't guess so, because also, like, okay, we reduced the participation of hydropower, but in the last 2 decades, we had like a huge growth of solar power and also wind power. And it was very shocking for me. At least I went to Intersolar workshop some weeks ago, and the reality is that solar power is nowadays the second source of the electricity matrix in Brazil, if you consider the distributed generation and the centralized generation. So it's incredible. Like in 10 years, maybe, we had like this renewable source in the second place in this matrix. And it wasn't different also like with wind power. So I think that we are doing our homework.
Okay, great, thanks. So when we talked about oil and gas, all the way in the beginning, you had talked about, and now you said it again, we're not going to, phase out of oil and gas, from one day to the next, maybe not even, in the foreseeable future. But maybe some plants will be closing down. Maybe yes, maybe no. I know that in Brazil, there has been a lot of debate on some thermal plants, similar debates maybe in Canada, and what is going to be done with the jobs, with the communities that, that depend on these plants for their survival. And that I want to use that to bring me into another question that we got here from someone watching us, which is, do Canadians face any challenges regarding energy justice? So when we talk about the just energy transition, when we talk about universal energy access, when we talk about energy poverty, Brazil comes to mind before Canada does, for reasons of stage of development of the country. But I was in touch with a number of people talking about similar issues in Canada. So David, if you want to take the floor first for that. And then Mariana, I want you to comment on some of the work that EPE has done also with energy access, and hear a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think this is an issue everywhere globally. I think when you talk about energy, it's not far from talking about energy to talking about basic human rights and access to. If you have unlimited energy, you could do a whole lot of stuff, right? And so when you look at transitions in Canada, we have First Nations that, again, we're working on reconciliation, how to engage them, how are they part of the solution. We've got northern communities that are unplugged from the electrical, they're using generation. They may be, using heating oil to get through the winters. How do we move to solutions that work for them? And, does zero emissions work if you're in Tuktoyaktuk up on the Arctic Circle where, minus 20 is a beautiful day? I think keeping these things in mind, as we transition, it's just the state of the world today that we talk about equity, diversity, inclusivity in Canada is at the foremost of all public policy, federally, provincially. And so it adds almost a complexity factor to try and to find the right solutions. And you see it in the policy. So even the carbon tax, the way it was originally proposed is that it would be taxed on energy and then payments would go back out to the population based on representative, and it was supposed to be seen as a way of redistributing wealth a little bit, almost tied to the energy use. And that's up to debate if it's doing that or if the tax is hurting the most vulnerable is a different debate. But I think it's there in the planning, it's there in the necessity, it's just the state of the world right now. That at least in Europe, in Canada, US, it's part of the equation to get it right as best you can. They never get it right, but the intent is to do that, right?
Mariana, do you want to comment now inside?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, like I really like the speech that Marcelo and David gave some time ago about how it's like extreme temperatures are seen in Canada, and it's very interesting to see that. I don't know if because we are a country like a tropical countries and we have like high temperatures along of the year, throughout of the year. I don't know if it's because of that, but I think that we minimize the bad impacts of heating in our quality, life quality. So, and it's crazy to think, because like nowadays we see that we have, like, when we compare people like in the lowest income class with people in the highest income class in Brazil, we see that we had a huge inequality in terms of access to air conditioning. Like, it's a difference of people in the highest income class consume 27 more air conditioning, energy for air conditioning, than the people in the lowest income class. So, and this is very alarming, because like we are in a country that, for example, now that we are in the winter, we are facing like temperatures that are difficult to deal with even in the summer. So this is very complicated. And there were like a very interesting report from BBC some days ago that talked about that, and also show how the heat that you feel when you are like in a house that it's isolating of the heat, like have the right construction standards. It's totally different from someone that lives like in a poor community, for example, in the slums, because you don't have ventilation, you don't have isolation. And so we need to think about these issues here in Brazil. And according to this study that we developed this year in EPE, we had the evidence that we have energy poverty in the country, and we still face a high inequality in the access to electricity service. Like, to have an idea, families that are in the highest income class like consume 6 times more electricity than people in the lowest income class. This is a result in the fact that we have here in the same country people living the life quality standards of someone in Morocco, and we have also people live here having the life quality standards of someone that is living in Japan. So we need to understand these disparities in energy access, and because one single energy policy won't fit all in this case, and we need to understand how to address this poverty issue. And nowadays we are trying to expand this study to also analyze the other energy sources that households have access in Brazil. And one of the main challenges that we already recognize, it's the case of the firewood. We see that it's concentrated in the lowest income classes, and this is something very complicated too, because we have nowadays a clean cooking policy that it's the Vale Gás, but it's strange to see that people are still using this kind of source like in a very inefficient way. And normally this source is like, it's normally like collect like in the nature. So and it's used like in stoves that has like a very low efficiency. So we need to think about this policy, how we can improve it to people have better life quality standards in Brazil.
Mariana, thanks. So I picked up from your answers, almost splitting Vitoria's question. Thank you, Vitoria, for your question, into two parts. When we talk about energy justice and energy poverty, energy inequality, we can look at remote areas, and we can look at almost the opposite, the very, very high population density, low income areas, such as Mariana mentioned with the slums, the reality in the favelas. Mitsidi recently did a study for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the ACNUR in Portuguese, to analyze the social economic impacts that energy efficiency and renewables can have in Roraima. So it's a very remote place. So a lot of conversation on energy access in the Amazon region, universality programs that are focused on that. And David, you talked a lot about remote areas, the far extreme north, a lot about the First Nations who living in their own lands. Marcel and David, do you see anything being done, any conversation, any studies? And if not, should there be in terms of energy poverty and energy equality also in urban areas in Canada? Is that a thing or is that non-existent?
Marcelo, do you want to go first? Go ahead.
Oh, no. You're the authority, David. Go ahead. I'll tag along.
Okay, I'm going to be just sometimes in Canada, there's a phrase that you can't see the forest because you're too busy looking at the trees. And I think when we look at this, we talk about energy and we can talk about food and we can say these are important, human rights and access, but they're also very convenient to control population. So there's politics around all things. I would say at the end of the day, if we had unlimited energy at no cost, we would have no problems with social disparity and people having no energy, no access. Whether we ratchet up our control access to control people, that's something different. The reality is the generation of energy right now is seen as having negative consequences. So we have carbon emissions, climate change, environmental pollution, nuclear waste, whatever the case is. And so the problem is, we're inducing this bad impact to generate energy, and then we're arguing over who controls the energy and who gets to use it at what cost. The long-term solution, if we can get to zero emissions on energy and we can get to, the cost, the more we can push the cost down, I would just challenge, I don't think it's a bad thing that people use energy. I think as a scientist, there's a direct causation between access to energy, use of energy, and quality of life. So when we talk about rationing energy or charging people or taxing use of energy, that's to get to the outcome, which is reducing the environmental and negative impacts. I would rather eliminate, as a technical person, eliminate the negative impacts and open the pipe on people being able to use more and abundant sources of energy to improve their quality of life. And that's counterintuitive, I know, to most of the discussion today, not here, but in public. But the reality is energy lets us do everything we want to do. And over the last 1,000 years, as we've gotten more access to more abundant energy, our quality of life for all has improved. And even the people that are impoverished by today's standards look pretty good compared to like 200 AD. So I think the point to get here is how do we eliminate the negative impacts of our energy systems? That's where the discussion is. How does our policy get there? If we get rid of the negative impacts and drop the cost of energy, we will see more people lifted out of poverty. That maybe that's a technology person's view of the world, but we forget the forest. That's the most important thing, is to get zero impact energy at as low a cost as we can so that it's accessible to all. I think arguing over rationing it and who should get it, ration it, and increasing the cost, to me is kind of counterintuitive to lifting people out of poverty. I don't know if that makes sense.
Marcelo, any comments to add to this?
Oh yeah, my head is falling here because I'm bobbing so much. I agree absolutely. I think this is, and again, this is my personal opinion, right? I don't think the answer is to start to restrict access to things that make life better. It's to reduce the negative impacts of having access to these things, and at the same time trying to make sure that more people have access to all these things. So I think this is valuable for energy. It's for personal security and safety. That's true for education, access to healthcare, food security. So right. So this is, I think it's part of a broader thing that speaks to social inequalities as a whole on a global level and sometimes on a more regional level. I think it's nice to see a business like Mitsidi with your two head offices now, if you will, like in Brazil and Canada, because from your presence in different places, you certainly learn different things that can cross-pollinate to each other. Like there are solutions that you probably saw that, David. Like I don't know if it was your first time in Brazil or not, but you go around and you look and say like, wow, how come they come up with that, right? It's like there are certain solutions to problems that you only come up with because you are in that reality. But then you take a tunnel vision and you do that in your reality and you forget that it's possible to do in a different way. And only when you have this multipolar vision, you're able to, like David said, to step away from the trees to start to see the forest or the mountain, right? So I think what you guys are doing is remarkable in that regard, right? Because you're taking this effort to step back from the day-to-day hustle, which is your phone is ringing, a client is asking, there's taxes to be paid, bills, whatever. But then once in a while, we have to question, it's like that old joke, right? The worst thing then when you climb the corporate ladder is to find out that your ladder was leaning against the wrong wall and you're up there now. It's like sometimes it's good to question if you're doing the right thing. So your question had to do with, I guess, for example, access to energy in an urban setting. You have poor neighborhoods and you have more wealthy neighborhoods. I mean, we see that here in Canada for sure. The big suburban homes with a lot of area that exchange heat with the environment versus small apartment or townhomes that consume way less energy because they don't exchange as much energy. But then you don't have your own personal space, right? Because you're kind of a more dense area. I mean, we see that kind of stuff. I think in Canada, what is very prevalent that everybody is aware of is the lack of access. In Brazil, it's different. In Brazil, if you're in Rio, all you have to do is to look out the window and you see a slum there and the beautiful neighborhood there. Like it's more this urban clash. In Canada, it's not so much. You typically are in very homogeneous areas, right? If you're in Calgary, you're in Calgary. If you're in Toronto, I mean, bigger places, you start to see a little bit of contrast. But where it really hits home in Canada is when you're talking about remote populations, about the indigenous reserves. If you're talking about northern provinces, I mean, there are places in Canada that even the gasoline has to go by airplane because there's no roads to drive there, right? I mean, these starts to create inequalities, right? Food is very expensive in some places because it has to be taken there by airplane, not by truck, right? So I think this is where Canadians are more aware of, as opposed to in Brazil, where I think it's a very urban thing. Inside the same city, you see the big inequalities.
Thank you, Marcel. We are now heading to the close of our debate. We have 10 minutes, so basically we're going to go now into the closing remarks. Is 2 hours too long? We could go on for another 2 hours, and we'll have so much to talk about. At least that's my feeling. There's a lot of things that I had written down here that I wanted to talk about today, but we won't have time. So just to head into these closing remarks, I wanted each of you to bring about some of your final considerations and reflections, but also keep in mind a few specific things. So one of them is that, just trying to summarize a lot of what I've heard is that in Brazil, in Canada, people in general see the importance of net zero, of changing something so that we can reduce climate change. Maybe even in Canada, society is more conscious of this than in Brazil, but some of the talks that I've heard. On the other hand, sometimes the head, the heart, and the hands aren't all going in the same direction. You know something is important, but then when it gets real and you have taxes, carbon taxes, and you have high rising prices, and this is starting to impact on your life, not necessarily the actions and the policies are going to follow with what you know deep down inside that it's a direction that's interesting. So everything is very complex in terms of how to equate the policy with people's daily lives, with justice and equality, and on the other hand, looking at the climate as a priority. So none of this is simple. And there are many priorities that come to people before we talk about energy efficiency and energy transition. Does that mean we should not think about energy transition? Absolutely not. But it means that there are a lot of challenges that we face on the roads going forward. And a lot of the solution that was brought forth is clean tech, innovation, technology. Those are the ways to make the energy transition cheaper, to bring oil and gas on board. Anyway, so we can have a whole other panel just to talk about entrepreneurship and clean tech environment and ecosystem in Canada and Brazil. I know for a fact that both of these countries have an extremely thriving and creative entrepreneurial ecosystem with a lot of creative tech solutions in different aspects, as Marcelo was saying, each one with their own necessities. So what I wanted you to keep in mind a little bit about, this technology, innovation, some of these things that I said, but also for your closing remarks to talk about collaboration between the countries. We're not creating any collaboration programs, official government programs. We could be, why not? But if you could create, okay, let's have one big, strong collaboration project, what could that be? Based on what you've heard today, have you heard any surprises, new things that you've learned and that you say, wow, we should really be working on this together. Our challenges are so similar. What would that be? So Marcelo, I'll start with you, and then Mariana and David. Closing remarks. And please,
thank you.
Just two minutes each so that we can finish on time.
Thank you. I think for me, it's what you're doing at Mitsidi, right? I don't work with the government, right? I don't work with big research institutions. I know all these things are present. We have the collaboration initiatives. If you go, like David was part of the mission with the chambers of commerce, you see the government, the minister of this talking to the minister of that, they agree on something that may or may not become something that works down the road. But I think that when you have specific businesses that have very unique approaches to what they do, and they're really good at what they do, and to a point that a presence in two countries, in Brazil and Canada, this presence provides very different things. A Canadian business will never have access to a market of 212 million people in your own country, right? I mean, population of Alberta, it is probably the population of Santo Amaro in Sao Paulo, right? So it's like, so you have the power of the local market. You have this vibrant, concentrated demographic density of companies and of people. So and you have the creativity, because in Brazil, because not everything is perfect, as we know, people have to be very creative. People have to sometimes improvise and find angles. You cannot wait until everything is perfect to start something. You need just to keep going and improvising along the way. This gives you as a business very strong antibodies globally. This can be redeployed in so many environments globally. But on the other hand, Brazil, and maybe because of the same reasons, because Brazil is so large domestically, it's very easy to forget that there's anything out there. And that's where Canada is very potent for small and mid-sized businesses. Because Canada, we grow up very aware that there is something out there. All you have to do is to turn on the TV and see Americans selling personal injury lawsuits on TV. We know there's a bigger world out there in another country. And many of us are immigrants. Canada has the largest, 23% of people living in Canada are permanent residents born in a different country. So we are very aware of the rest of the world. We believe in technology. we believe in trade agreements with doing business with other countries, and we like to position ourselves globally. So I think it's what you guys are doing, Alexandre. How can we increase collaboration? Yeah, politicians are going to talk politics, and God bless them, and let them keep doing the ministers talking to the ministers. At the end of the day, what we can do is like small to mid-sized companies see the benefits of being present in both places and keep cross-pollinating these two things to make the business better and ultimately your client base and causing an impact in the society you operate in.
Marcelo, thank you. Mariana, closing remarks, surprises from today, things you've learned, what we can be collaborating with Canada.
Yeah, no, I really like the event and I learned a lot. I think that, like, especially this last speech of Marcelo, it's very interesting to think how Canada, with this other point of view, this other international point of view, can contribute for us. I lived in the US too, and it's very funny because I had contact with people from other countries, and every time that I was with a Brazilian person, like, we were all the time talking only about Brazil. We are very egocentric sometimes. So I think that this is a very good learning that we can bring, and that Canada can help us also to develop, and also how to create more bridges to make this partnership with other countries. This is very interesting. And I agree that this individual initiative between companies, as we have now, can potentialize like other big efforts, as for example, Canada contributing for fundings that are organized by the World Bank or by the Inter-American Development Bank or BNDES. So I think that it's a way that we can show our individual power to help in this process of energy transition and to have like a more just energy transition.
Thank you, Mariana. David, floor is yours. Closing remarks, surprises, collaboration.
Yeah, so I'd say thanks, Mitsidi, for the opportunity. I think this is what's needed. I agree with everything Marcelo said. The context is Canada's population now is over 40 million. If you look at the global population, we're high energy uses per person, but as a collective, it's still a rounding error in the global world. The problem we need to solve is a global problem. It's going to require collaboration from all countries. Big countries like Brazil in terms of population, China, India, US, Europe. So we have to communicate, we have to develop programs and technologies that benefit all. But I think the one thing that hasn't been said is it's really the challenge facing us is interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary. And you need social scientists working with natural scientists, working with engineers, working with, medical disciplines and health sciences, because it's impacting all disciplines. So these conversations are incredibly important. It's important that we communicate. And the only thing I'll challenge Marcelo, the politicians may be politicians and they may chat, but coming from the innovation world, stable policy is the mother of all investment, as a colleague of mine, Passmore, once said from IAGID. So I would say if the policies aren't right, it's incumbent upon the consultants, the academics, the industry to keep the government informed of what's needed and why it's needed and what policies are effective and unintended consequences. So I think it involves everybody to lift the ship at this point. And I think it's incumbent upon us to build these networks. And the programs you're talking about, Alex, are really about how do we incentivize that interdisciplinary and team building, not competitiveness of individual labs, if that makes sense. So I'll leave that as my close.
Perfect. We are exactly on the mark. It is 4:00 p.m. in Brazil, 3:00 p.m. in Toronto, 1:00 p.m. in Alberta. So thank you so much for the three of you for being here. This was an extraordinary conversation, in my point of view, talking about very highly technical aspects in a very non-technical way, actually. There was some technical in our conversations, which is absolutely necessary. And at the same time, we see that there's so much involved in human relations and culture and policy in society that really direct everything that we are talking about. So a message to all who are watching: tomorrow, same time, different link, but same YouTube channel, we have another international panel in English, demand-side programs around the world, consultant representative from Brazil, government representative from the Ministry of Energy of Chile, and also consulting American firm that works in the US and Canada on demand-side management programs. And on Friday, going into what David was saying now, energy jobs and the energy transition, moderated by Rosane Fukuoka, and so a Brazilian panel to close off the day, where we will be talking exactly about what are these different disciplines that are necessary. How can people understand enough about energy and digitalization, digital world programming, and medicine, and whatever? What are all the, the disciplines that have to be coming together? And today they're not yet coming together. So that's the discussion that's going to be on Friday. Thank you once again to the three of you. Very, very big thanks. Thanks to all who are watching, participating, and sending your questions. And we will see you all tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. See you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Good afternoon. Bye-bye.